The good thing about technology is it allows you to leapfrog, and information revolution has percolated to almost every village across the country, not just in Ranchi, not just in Jharkhand.
Hello and welcome. I'm your host Pritish Sanyal and you're listening to the 1% Project. Conversations that will help you understand how some of the smartest minds build, scale and operate new ideas and ventures. If you enjoy these conversations, do share and subscribe. My next guest on the 1% Project is Rai Mahimapat Ray. He is a District Magistrate of Ranchi District in the state of Jharkhand in India. A District Magistrate is an Indian Administrative Service officer who is the chief in charge of the administration and the governance of a district in India. Ray is responsible for the well-being and the development of 3.3 million people in the Ranchi district, which has a diverse demographic spread across remote villages without developed roads or schools to upcoming cities where universities and businesses successfully thrive. We kick this conversation off with Ray trying to understand the Indian administrative services, the progress, the challenges, and the opportunities Indians have, and how IS officers like him are working to better the lives and mitigate the challenges of everyday Indians. We also talk about the COVID situation in Ranchi and the measures he has taken to keep the pandemic in control. All views are personal and don't represent the views of the government of India or the government of Jharkhand. Welcome to the 1% Project. I'm very excited to have you on the show.
Hi Pritish, it's good to meet you after all these years and thanks for having me on board.
Can you tell us who is an IS officer and how do you become one?
So the Indian Administrative Service, or the IAS for short, is an imperial legacy in that sense of the word. It was created effectively post the British period, but it is a direct successor of the Indian Civil Service, which was created to kind of administer a large colonial enterprise. Why it was renamed was because the Indian Administrative Service was then supposed to take on a more developmental and proactive role. But many of the structures that govern the IAS remain still the same as they were in the imperial project. For example, the office that I hold today, that is the District Magistrate / Collector / Deputy Commissioner. These were fixtures or titles that were given specifically because Collector of Land Revenue, which is now a marginal function, but rather a collector of custodian of land records, or Deputy Commissioner in the sense of for powers of Judicial Magistrate, or District Magistrate for ensuring law and order. These were three basic gambits that used to be there in the pre-India period. However, now with the coming in of a slightly welfare state and with a mind which providing citizen-enabled services, the mandate is much larger. So an Indian Administrative Service officer is basically effectively the CEO of the district. Now a district is effectively a county or a large administrative geographical area. For example, in the case of Ranchi, it's about 5,500 square kilometers with a population of about 3.3 million. Now, every of these citizenry needs are indirectly or directly monitored by the district magistrate. Whether it is from as simple an eulogy that I gave is from the time a citizen wakes up in the morning to the time he sleeps and wakes up again, almost 95% of all his daily activity is some way linked to the district magistrate's office. For example, if you were to go to the bathroom, you switch on plumbing. If the water has failed, then that is at some level a problem of the drinking water and sanitation department, which has a committee which is headed by the chairman as the deputy commissioner. Mm-hmm. If the electricity has failed, there is a superintendent's committee for monitoring electricity. Step out on the road, whether it's land acquisition for road, whether it's encroachment removal for road, whether it's demarcation of zones for road, those aspects also come directly or indirectly under the Deputy Commissioner's office. So you have about close to 100 verticals, with about each vertical having close to, depending on the manpower availability that is there, but approximately each district hires or has about close to about 25,000 government civil servants. Whether they may be teachers, they may be doctors, they may be engineers, they may be service infrastructure. And the district magistrate is supposed to be a coordinating agency as well as a superintending agency, and is also the point of contact for any sort of disaster or coordination effort. And that is where the role of COVID comes into play.
Before we get into COVID, and I read your article on how you have been able to manage the COVID situation, can you tell how do you become an IS officer?
The Chinese invented the exam method and the British kind of made it better. The Indian Administrative Service is an examination that happens every year. It's a 3-stage examination process. Approximately 0.9 million people take it, and about 180 enter the IS, and then others enter other allied services and or may opt for other services as well. For example, the Foreign Service or the Police Service or the Income Tax or the Revenue. And about 900 odd people make it. It's a 3-step process. You have a MCQ-based exam, then you have a written-based exam, and then you have finally an interview.
Coming to the COVID situation, I read an article on how you have been able to manage the situation specifically in your district. Tell us, how have you been able to work through it to get it under control?
I think any situation which is in many ways not been predefined, like the COVID situation, it is very difficult to say that you have it under control. What best you can do is mitigate the effects, both on the positive as well as the negative side. By positive, I mean, for example, having establishments in place which can handle COVID patients, having methods in place by which COVID patients can be tracked. Any contacts that they have can be screened and then evaluated for testing, and mitigating the spread, so to speak. The positive measures would obviously then be being able to provide relief to people who have been adversely affected by the lockdown, especially the senior citizen, or it is the young children, or it is those that are particularly vulnerable, for example, cancer patients, HIV positive patients, sex workers, transgender, LGBT communities, and the like. So on both fronts, one of the things that we realized in Ranchi was that as a team, we needed to be able to stay slightly ahead of the curve. And our learning was made easier simply because we were able to learn from the experience of others. Because thankfully, Jharkhand was slightly behind the curve as far as India is concerned, and India itself was slightly behind the curve when it comes to Italy or Spain. So there are many learnings that we could take out. For example, the use of ventilators. So we realized early on that ventilators may only be required for only about 2 to 4% of COVID patients. So the focus should be on having COVID care centers, that is, people can be isolated in a place which has certain amount of medical practitioners, so that if anything goes south, they're immediately able to be shifted. So our focus was not so much on ventilators, but on setting up establishments where they could be monitored. Also, because this is a period of lockdown, we found that there was a huge pool of very skilled resources that was available as part of our volunteer effort. They were drawn upon, and they really, really helped us in being able to combat any problem that came. And obviously, with a situation like COVID, in any disaster, decision making has to be on the fly. But in COVID, especially with limited sources of information, especially credible information, any plan that was made had to have a certain degree of flexibility in it. And I think that was one of the key learnings from it.
You mentioned that there were certain segments which had higher impact, sex workers or aid patients. How did you manage them? Because if I look at a sex worker, as you mentioned, how do they even survive? And what kind of precaution can they take?
Initially, the biggest problem was that workers were not willing to identify themselves. Because as you know, that has a legal and a social stigma both attached to it. So we used our outreach through civil society volunteers who helped us identify them and also bridge the gap, so to speak. And we had an initiative called Each One Feed One, which was essentially an initiative where each person could donate just 2,000 rupees, which is close to less than about $50. And that initiative allowed them, each family, to get dry rations. So basically, what subsistence food for over a month. So that allowed them that liberty to be able to survive. Also, the civil society organization reached out to them, made them understand that for the time being, it's in their interests to avoid any sort of physical contact.
I'm sure you would have also had to go through the situation of all these migrant workers coming back from Maharashtra, which is one of the highest hit states with COVID cases, and Gujarat as well. How did you handle that situation?
So Ranchi was the destination for the first Shramik train. Shramik train being migrant train that was moved. Ranchi being a major transit point in Jharkhand, obviously handled a fairly large amount of migrant labor returning back. And one of our first primary causes of concern was to obviously be able to isolate them, because they may be carriers, latent or with symptoms. Having isolated them, we also needed to provide them immediate food relief. As a result of which, the government of Jharkhand came up with a scheme whereby each migrant was given ration for 14 days so that they could be quarantined in their own homes without actually having to, any of their family members having to step out. Any high-risk patient who was screened and found to be suffering any of the ILI symptoms, influenza-like symptoms, were then kind of taken to a government free isolation facility and were held there for 14 days, tested, and then let go. However, the biggest challenge that comes is once the migrant labor comes back. Because obviously the reason for migration is the same as you, Pritish, or I am. There were not enough job opportunities in the place where we left. Tomorrow, there is going to be a problem. And so the same issue is now coming up. We're trying to mitigate it by having a census. By the census, I mean we are doing a skill mapping of which skill each migrant has and trying to get them absorbed in local industry. And more important than that, trying to formulate a long-term action plan so that they don't have a reason to leave again. At least some of them should be absorbed. Those that are willing to leave. There may be some that may actually want to go back, but those that do not should be absorbed. And the government of Jharkhand in that sense is actually made a plan. As of right now, for temporary measure, they have been given relief under the MNREGA, which is the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, one of the largest in the world. But that is a short-term measure. The long-term measure being that they should get meaningful, gainful employment in their home village or their home district at least.
So how do you assess the COVID situation of India presently across the whole country?
See, I would not be a very good judge of the COVID situation across the country. I can tell you about Ranchi per se.
Sure.
When in Ranchi, we had a strategy which was high testing. High testing, high contact tracing. And then severe containment. In the sense that even if there's one patient that is diagnosed in a particular locality, we identify each of his contacts. Approximately each positive leads to about 40 to 60 people who are then screened, sampled, tested, depending on it, and also isolated for 14 days. One of the key takeaways of that has been that our testing rate is far higher than the state average. The highest in many ways in the number of tests conducted.
Right.
We have also been able to a large extent, curtail our explosion. So for example, our doubling rate today is about 37 days.
That's good.
That is a decent figure. So what is happening is that we are seeing every day we have some cases. For example, at present we have about 48 active cases, which is a fairly sustainable number in the sense of the public health, as you would know and as others would know. Jharkhand being a particularly remote location and a state, it has unique challenges when it comes to medical infrastructure. So any large spurt would lead to collapse of health infrastructure. As of today, we have about 170 dedicated COVID beds in hospitals, dedicated hospitals. Till the time we are under that radar, we are easily able to curtail. When in our next stage, in case we have an exponential growth, then we can go up to about 1,000 beds. But after 1,000 beds, it will have to be an emergency measure.
Sure.
We'll have to get stadiums converted and what we're seeing in Delhi today.
COVID has brought out some loopholes in the system. What would be your suggestions to the government?
We can always look back and keep revisiting decisions. I'm sure you're aware of this case where a pilot had to land on the Hudson.
Yeah.
And it became a major bookseller. And one of the lines that I remember from that is, he said that any mathematical model would have predicted the outcome that I did. But there was no mathematical model at that point of time. So in the same way, when you look at COVID response, obviously there could have been other methods of responding to it, whether it was a carrying migrant issue, whether it was issue of lockdown timing, unlockdown timing. Having said that, I think the way forward has to be that how do we look at a strategy in which we have living with COVID as well as being able to mitigate the effects of COVID, while at the same time preventing our most vulnerable population, which is our plus 60s. One of the things I think that is under talked about, and that is a gut that I have as a practitioner, is that there is definitely some role to play of maybe genetic factors, maybe BCG vaccination factors, maybe something else, which have allowed for COVID to have a far larger number of asymptomatic cases in Ranchi especially. And also there are far fewer super spreaders, so to speak, in Ranchi than it is seen, say, in Italy or in Spain.
You have been an IS officer for almost a decade. How would you assess the development of India? Is India shining? Is Digital India taken off? What is your assessment of the last 10 years?
I think the India of 2010-11 was very different from the India of 2020. And when you say about the IT revolution, I think it's less of a revolution and more of a work in progress. And it is progressing at a phenomenally fast pace. Development by itself is a tricky subject. It takes some places, it percolates faster. For example, if you look at Bangalore, 10 years ago, and you look at Bangalore today, you would not be able to recognize the same town.
Yeah.
If you were to look into certain pockets of rural Ranchi, they may not resemble exactly what was 10 years ago, but there is the change is not at that same rate. Having said that, I'm very hopeful about India, simply because there are things that are happening which at one point of time were thought to be impossible. For example, if I go to hinterland in Ranchi itself, people's aspirations have changed. The demographic profile also helps. We are a very young country, and I think that has also helped in the COVID situation. When you have people coming back as migrant labor, they themselves talk about how they don't mind not going back simply because when they had left that Ranchi, that was a very different Ranchi from what they had left. I think 10 years has seen a quantum progress. It would not be an arithmetic progress, but a geometric progress. And that's what makes me really, really hopeful.
You're saying that the migrant worker who's coming back may potentially bring a revolution or a massive upliftment. We are always looking at the digital revolution, Paytm, digital banks. But you also mentioned that there has been upliftment, there has been betterment, aspiration has grown in the hinterlands and the inner parts of the country. But has all of this technology actually percolated to these villages and jillas?
The good thing about technology is that it has the power to leapfrog. For example, on Tuesday, I'd gone to an area where there's hardly any road. There was somebody who told me that he will WhatsApp me the problem. The good thing about technology is it allows you to leapfrog. And information revolution has percolated to almost every village across the country, not just in Ranchi, not just in Jharkhand. There are now very, very few unconnected villages. When I joined the service, in 2013, I was posted as Subdivisional Magistrate in one of India's most left-wing extremist, violent hit districts, as Khunti. And I would often go to villages where there was no mobile internet. There was no mobile tower, but people had mobiles.
How did they work?
No, they worked for a different reason. They were sources of entertainment. And this was way back in 2014. You had these little hearts, which are basically like a farmer's market of sorts, weekly, where you'd have solar panels attached with battery chargers being sold because they were off grid. This is way back in 2014. And you had these small entrepreneurs, so to speak, who would go around villages and charge 10 rupees for a movie download. This was way back in 2015. And today, when I go to villages, I see young men and women both getting information off the net.
You mentioned internet, mobile, WhatsApp has reached the innermost parts of the country. What hasn't reached? What do you want to happen or reach these people in the next 10 years?
One of the greatest challenges that India faces today is malnutrition, especially Ranchi. The greatest asset that we have is the demographic base that we have, young demographic. But a malnourished demographic dividend would not have its outcome. Secondly, the other thing that I see is that until we get into skill training in a big way, our education system needs to change. I'm sure, Pritish, you realize that what we learned in class 12 is pretty much, our A levels are pretty much useless. I really don't see any use of having learned why Shylock charged what he did.
A pound of flesh.
Pound of flesh, exactly. So we need to definitely have a major revamp in our skilling models. I think that is something that is happening, but it needs to happen faster and much more.
A quick fire. So I'm going to ask you 4 questions and you just need to give me 1 word or 1 sentence responses. A book or a blog that has transformed the way you think?
A book that is transformed. Lots of them. I'm an avid reader. But I think the last one that I read was Anarchy. I think that left an influence.
Another country that you closely monitor, whose development you think has been commendable?
Brazil. Much more a closer model that we need to look at, whether it is from issues of democracy to corruption to issues of education to nutrition.
Lucknow or Ranchi?
Lucknow any day.
If not an IS officer, then what? Ray, it was exciting and thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, Pritish, for having me on board.
You can find the show notes for this episode and every other episode on 1%.live. If you enjoyed this conversation, share it on social media and leave a review. See you next time.